struggle for liberation of South Africa was widespread and over many years. It included activists in the United States and South Africa. It reached a peak with the liberation of Nelson Mandela from prison, which paved the way for the toppling of apartheid and the creation of a system of one person, one vote. Chris Hanis was a leader second in popularity only to Mandela. His legacy is the trilateral alliance of the South African Communist Party, the African National Congress, and the Congress of South African Trade Unions. This alliance leads the people's struggle today in South Africa, the fight against privatization, and particularly against the role of the pharmaceutical companies with respect to HIV/AIDS.
We've come here to renew our commitment to the struggle for liberation. We've come here to reaffirm the right of the oppressed and exploited people of South Africa to mass action.
In 1999, there was a one-day general strike in which 550,000 people struck nationally.
My particular version of his specific contribution to this new South Africa was his role in those last 3-4 years of his life. Because I think it gives light to one popular version of the negotiated transition in South Africa. There's a view that it was all about negotiations, and that two great leaders, one from the camp of apartheid, F.W. de Klerk, and one from the liberation movement, great Nelson Mandela, discovered each other and had the intelligence to negotiate a settlement. That is clearly part of the story, but what I think gets hidden in that is the role of mass mobilization and mass organization through those last 3 years of complicated negotiated transitions.
The challenge really in South African society and the society we want to build is the resolution of what, as the SACP, we call the principal strategic contradiction. It's a contradiction between, on the one hand, those forces who would like to see the most thorough democratic transformation and economic transformation of our society, of which the working class is the core. But on the other hand, there are a block of forces who are trying to modernize some kind of a non-racial capitalism in South Africa, where a few will continue to benefit, including co-opting some elements from the previously oppressed into that agenda. That is the core of the struggle today. It's between those two parts.
The situation in South Africa is the same situation throughout Africa. There is no real firm control of the economic resources. Our countries are trying to fight for that now, in the second stage. People are demanding, better housing. They're demanding better health care. They're demanding, to get rid of diseases as AIDS. And I think that AIDS is more of a social disease, social pathology than it is sort of because of HIV.
A high percentage of AIDS victims are in Africa, but there's nothing that shows that in fact there's been any piracy in terms of medication to treat those people. There has not been. So that story of piracy we are not buying, but we are understanding that the fundamental thing are the profits for the pharmaceuticals, and the American government is on the side of profits, not on the side of the poor.
Given the tendency of globalization to erode state sovereignty, particularly for developing countries, the question of the transformation of the state acquires added significance. And the key challenge is the building of a developmental state that plays an active interventionist role in the economy in order to take forward our national development agenda. But we think in order to attain these goals, we have two weapons as a movement. And let's not forget about that. It's the state instruments themselves, and on the other hand, our organized mass power.
But in 1990, at the time of the unbanning of the organizations, the return of Chris Hanis and others from exile, the apartheid regime was besieged considerably and wasn't working, and was in a great structural crisis. But at the same time, the strength of the liberation movement was not sufficient to topple the apartheid regime, In some respects, things had stagnated a little bit for the liberation movement as well in 1990, particularly the external situation, so the collapse of the Soviet Union and the Soviet bloc, which had been a very important factor in the balance of forces in southern Africa. That had impacted upon our strength and capacity to push ahead with our revolutionary struggle. The situation in what we call the frontline states of Zimbabwe, Mozambique, Angola, which were very important to our ability to sustain struggle, that situation had deteriorated very considerably, partly as a result of global factors and partly as a result of the terrible destabilization of the rest of the region by the apartheid system. So there was a kind of reciprocal siege between the liberation movement and the apartheid regime in 1990. Both had strength, both weakened, and it was that laid the basis for the possibility of a negotiated transition. The first contribution that Chris Hanis made in this situation was to give it a name. He said that we needed to understand that the negotiations were serious and the regime was serious about those negotiations, but it was also at the same time, as part of its negotiation strategy, using violence. And he was quite right about that, and by and large the violence was quite strategically targeted against not the negotiators, not those sitting in the World Trade Center, which was the forum in which we negotiated, but was directed at the key linkages between the senior national leadership of the ANC and its movement and its mass base.
It was a well planned by the right-wing intelligence network to assassinate people like Hanis. And to me, what was clear to them, who's the possible next president of the ANC, of the next president of the country, if the ANC wins the election, if Mandela goes. In their analysis, it was clear that it would be Chris Hanis. And they didn't want to be led by a communist. So the best thing is to ensure that you assassinate him now, before now the election.
Chris Hanis was one of the most dynamic forces that the African National Congress had in its human arsenal. As a person who was chief of staff to Kunta Wasizwe, as a person who was a member of the Communist Party of South Africa, as a person who was in the hierarchy of the African National Congress, as a person who was a key organizer, all of those talents combined in one man shows why he was assassinated, why there was a preemptive strike to take out a man that the regime really, truly feared.
What are all liberators? What the people who are going to make sacrifices and who are going to accept no prescriptions from anybody. We are going to determine our strategy and the tactics of our struggle.